Hello, everyone. Today we are going to chat with Quinn Slobodian. He is professor of international history at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. One of his books, Globalists, has been translated into Turkish. But today we are mainly going to talk about his most recent book, Hayek's Bastards, and his other book, Crack-Up Capitalism. Of course, they both are related very deeply in terms of global capitalism's recent tendencies. But yeah, we mainly will focus on these two books. Welcome, Mr. Slobodian.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so let's first talk about the famous term neoliberalism. Because both in politics and academia, the prevailing narrative, especially after the 2008 crisis, is that neoliberalism has ended or at best faltered, and that we now live in a post-neoliberal world with Brexit and the second Trump administration. In your book, Hayek's Bastards, you point to very different branches and carriers of neoliberalism, and in a sense reversing the narrative that neoliberalism is dead. What would you like to say about this? What does the term neoliberalism actually tell us, and are we still being governed by neoliberals on both sides of the Atlantic today?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly one of those words that are sometimes called weasel words that tend to get used in a number of sometimes contradictory ways. So I think it's always helpful to begin by breaking it down into at least 4 different ways the term gets used, which I think I can summarize quite quickly. One way that it gets used is to describe a kind of period of time. So people say we have entered the neoliberal era, and then they ask if the neoliberal era is over. And sometimes that gets dated to the 1970s or the era of Reagan and Thatcher. And then the question becomes, did it end with the great financial crisis? Did it end with Trump and Brexit? And so on. Another way it gets used is to describe a kind of policy package. So privatization, liberalization, deregulation, often associated with the Washington Consensus. And people talk about neoliberalism then arriving in a country, let's say after socialism or under structural adjustment, and then sometimes rolling out and then rolling back neoliberal policies. So you could then look around the world and say this country is more neoliberal than that country, and so on. Another way it gets used is to describe a kind of relationship people have to themselves and others. So this idea of being an entrepreneur of oneself, seeing yourself as a kind of bundle of assets that needs to be deployed and leveraged in the market by gaining, followers, wealth, prestige, and so on. So that's a kind of mentality or a subjectivity of neoliberalism. But then fourthly, there's neoliberalism as a pretty discrete intellectual movement. So since the 1930s, there has been a group of people who called themselves neoliberals, who were trying to figure out a political philosophy between socialism on the left and hard fascism on the right. And those conversations are associated with people like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and there people have met periodically and see themselves kind of in the lineage of Hayek and Friedman in various ways. And that fourth way is the way that I've entered the subject. So rather than trying to make grand statements about the death of neoliberalism globally or to understand the effects of this or that policy change, the approach I've taken in my books and the one I take in the most recent one, Hayek's Bastards, is to approach it like an intellectual historian. So the same way someone would study conservative thought or anarchist thought or socialist thought, find divisions in the orthodoxy, changes in the doctrine, I have taken that approach in my own work. So that's where I come in, and that's probably most of the way we'll talk about it. If forced, I'm happy to make larger statements about neoliberalism at large. And there, I mean, to put it very briefly, I think that after 2008, people expected the end of a certain idea of rule-based economic order. It actually didn't die. You had the rebirth of a certain kind of multilateralism, central bank-driven economic governance, focus on economic freedom rather than equality. 2016, you had the first cracks, I think, with Trump in the free trade consensus, but more or less still quite libertarian policy internally, actually. Bidenomics and Biden, I think, was an attempt quite explicitly to break with neoliberal models of organizing the economy. And then Trump, too, has, I think, accelerated this process even more. So now the way that Trump conducts economic policy, especially on the global stage, has very little to do with neoliberal doctrine, even when internally the policy remains deregulation, tax cuts, putting a power into the hands of entrepreneurs and private actors and taking it away from public authorities. So that's the condensed version of an answer to your question.
And maybe that the point is, we have to follow is the alliance formed by maybe Silicon Valley elites, neoconservatives, and libertarians around 1970s, because your book is also pointing that those currents are different currents, but they have an alliance after the 1970s. So they don't see the collapse of the Soviet Union and the world communism as a victory, because perhaps their fundamental concern can be summarized as follows: burying the 20th century. I think in your book, Crack-Up Capitalism, one of the guru of the neoliberal thinkers say that phrase. This century was marked not only by Soviet socialism, but also by the Western welfare state model. What does this new alliance, following in the tradition of maybe Ludwig Mises and Hayek, have against the welfare state? In fact, shouldn't they be considered mainstream neoliberalism rather than marginal in this regard?
Well, I think that one of the helpful ways to understand the stakes or the primary fault lines in neoliberal thought at different moments is to ask yourself, who are they opposing? Who do they see as the greatest threat to market order, to capitalist stability, to economic freedom? And that answer to that question changes from decade to decade. So in the 1930s, when neoliberals first came together, when liberalism in the sense of classical liberalism prioritizing political freedom and economic freedom was really at an all-time low, right? Collectivism was surging in every part of the world. So they saw themselves in the defensive, and they were trying to figure out a version of their political philosophy that they could use to defend against the different kinds of collectivism. So really, communists and fascists. And they were much more willing to ally with fascists when necessary against communists. Go to the 1960s. Well, the world is decolonizing. Post-colonial countries now become the biggest fear. Go to the 1970s. The move by the global South countries to do new international economic order is of a great concern. There's a great period of worker uprisings and strikes. So organized labor is, again, a concern for the neoliberals. By the 1990s, as you're suggesting, the end of the Cold War, many of those old enemies are defeated. So the Communist Party is no longer a concern by the 1990s. Why should you spend your effort worried about formal, party-style communism? Mm-hmm. Yeah, across the world, those are even places like Italy, where they had persisted, deep into the 20th century. By the 1990s, no longer a political factor. Basically the same in France as well. So who do you worry about? Who's the enemy? that's the way that they start their analyses, I would say, is they ask who the enemy is, and then the analysis follows from there. They see the enemy in new social movements. So the movements of feminism, the movements of the civil rights movement, which has turned into anti-racism and demands for affirmative action. And really, most of all, this was one of the surprises, and it wasn't something I sort of set out to find, but it was literally a discovery reading the coverage from early 1990s. They're very concerned about the environmental movement and the ecological movement. So the idea was quite common, and you see this, for example, in a Wall Street Journal article that's covering the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was created by Hayek and others to be the carrier of the intellectual movement. First meeting after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What are they worried about? They're worried about environmentalism and the concern about the greenhouse effect and global warming. The fear there is that the enemy has gone from red to green, and now we need to come up with new forms of opposition and counter mobilization to negate this enemy. So this, this is part of the main story really I'm telling in Hayek's Bastards, is how neoliberals saw new threats at the end of the Cold War. Part of it was new social movements from the 70s, which had gained more mass appeal. And the other thing, as you suggest with reference to the welfare state, was their observation that even though you had had Margaret Thatcher in power, Ronald Reagan in power, the Washington Consensus rolled out through the global South, the welfare state actually continued to exist in the industrialized world. So the National Health Service in the UK still exists. The Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid in the United States still exists. And the percentage of the state budget, the GDP that was being spent by the state, actually wasn't going down. So they started to see some connection between these things. There's a connection between the post-60s social movements and the persistence of the social state. They're part of a same sort of complex that still persists after the end of Soviet-style communism, and that's what needs to be pulled up by the roots to get to the core of the problem.
I think they also connected the welfare state and the civil rights movements of 60s as a connection between a racialization of welfare state, I guess, and also the cracking of family values, the white family values also. They claim that welfare state is undermining the white Protestant American family values, and this is the core of our capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't. Yeah, that's correct. So it's they were not wrong to see a connection between the mobilizations of the 1960s and then new kinds of welfarism. So the Great Society programs of Lyndon B. Johnson at the end of the 1960s were really the economic complement to the expansion of voting rights in the United States. So that was saying, if we want equality in the United States, it can't just be everyone has a right to vote because everyone's coming from such unequal origin places. You need to have some way of providing a safety net for everyone, however minimal. And in the minds of neoconservatives and neoliberals, to provide things like welfare for single mothers, or to allow for people to do, for example, no-fault divorce, the spread of reproductive rights, either through birth control pills or access to abortion, they saw these things as both moral dangers and fiscal dangers. So they were both undermining the fabric of the male-oriented nuclear family, and they were causing more strain on the state budget by, in their mind, forcing the government to finance the permissive sexual mores of parts of the population. Now, their understanding of the proportion was always way off, right? It was simply not the case that the funding going to unwed mothers was somehow the core budget issue. In fact, it was much more about military spending and spending on veterans and things of that nature. But for them, they saw that as the core of the disease, the social disease. And so you needed to solve that problem, and you would then solve all of the others.
Mm-hmm. And if we follow their intellectual lineage, both the figures you examine in Crack-Up Capitalism and Hayek's Bastards seem to follow a similar intellectual trajectory, an anti-enlightenment tradition. I mean, more or less like Edmund Burke or Herder style or Nietzsche style aristocratic rebellion. They have hostility toward racial, sexual, and class equality, and universal ideas is a defining theme in their intellectual trajectory. In contrast, they defend sort of cultural particularism and biological racism or genetic, or they defend going back to nature. They defend racial, geographical, sexual segregation, and also a kind of neo-colonialism, not just they want to colonize the earth, but they also want to colonize space like Mars or Moon. How do you think these ideas, which were expelled or believed to have been expelled after World War II, have become fashionable again in the West today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to see that if you just use this perspective of looking at neoliberal intellectuals, there was surprising level of unity amongst them from, let's say, the 1930s to the 1990s. So because there was that common enemy, I think, of, the socialists within and the socialists without, there was a willingness to have a kind of united front. Everyone knew who the true bad guys were. They were sitting in Musk'a, they were sitting in Havana. They were often sitting in, sociology and history departments in universities in the United States. With the end of the Cold War, though, you do get this, and this is how we started the conversation, a moment of disorientation where there's almost the question of, have we actually won? If so, what can we expect about social order now that the end of socialism has truly arrived? Or more commonly, the way they felt was we actually maybe have not won, and that the enemy has simply transformed. So in response to that moment, you do get a pretty serious split then in the neoliberal movement. One, it's just, I want to be sure to point out, was actually willing to work with, let's say, a rules-based order and took the victory on its face. So maybe they did win. Maybe you can use, for example, the World Trade Organization. You can use investment law. You can use control of government to create a situation that is better for business, worse for poor people, but good for innovation, good for makers, and worse for takers. Many of the neoliberals actually saw partnerships with Bill Clinton, saw partnerships with Bush, even saw partnerships with people like Obama. And we see the end of that lineage now in things like the abundance movement in the United States, where you have libertarians and neoliberals who are actually still very worried about the populists, worried about the racists, and they want to continue neoliberalism as a kind of technocratic project of lawmaking, regulation design in ways that move forward productivity with no attention to things like social welfarism, let alone climate change. So that's one approach. That's not the approach that I've really written books about recently, right? The ones that I've written about is the one you're describing, which was the other side, which says, no, we are worried now that those very institutions, whether it's the UN, the WTO, the court system in the United States, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, whatever, that the government is now going to be co-opted by the new socialists. So the progressives are now going to use the architecture of order as a Trojan horse to roll out a new form of globalism which will end up working against the interests of economic freedom. So the idea that, it must be said, this is not total fantasy, right? If you look at the UN in the 1990s, what are they talking about? They're talking about human rights. They're talking about women's rights. They're talking about environmentalism. So if you're a person on the right, a person who's a strong neoliberal, you might have reason to be concerned and to think that, oh, the international system is now gone to the left and it's now going to come for economic freedom, especially with things like Kyoto, Paris Accords. There's reasons for them to worry that the tide is now shifting in a way they hadn't expected. So what do? Well, they do the kind of things you're describing, which is they say, all right, what kind of resources exist to stabilize order and to create a new opposition against these forms of intervention? How can we speak to people at a basic level that will appeal to their emotions, their deep sense of identity, that will draw them into projects of resistance now against top-down, progressive, woke globalism? Well, I mean, they quite literally then start to say that people's attachment to their racial identity, people's attachment to their nation, which earlier eras of neoliberals had seen as a problem. Earlier eras of neoliberals had said people are too attached to their nation, too attached to their race. We need to educate them into being global market actors. Now the feeling is that you can call on those resources of connection to the soil, connection to the skin, connection to the family, and use that as a new resistance to top-down ordering. And that's the project of the so-called paleo movement in the 1990s. So everyone watching this has heard of neoconservatism, but probably not everyone has heard about paleoconservatism. And it's very important to know the difference. So neoconservatives, after the end of the Cold War, said Soviet Union is dead, but the American mission lives on. Now it's about democracy promotion. Now it's about securing America's resources globally. So it's securing human rights. So it's the Balkan Wars, it's Somalia, it's Gulf War 1 and 2, it's Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror. That's neoconservatism. At the same time, there were a small but significant block of people on the American right who said this is wrong. America fought the Cold War and won, and now it should return to America's borders and focus on really the enemy within. There are very, very strong echoes in current American foreign policy of this paleoconservative position, which is significantly different, I think, from neoconservatism because it's not seeking universal rule. It's saying Putin can have his sphere of influence there, Xi Jinping can have his sphere of influence there, and we should focus on rooting out dangers at home. So there were parts of the libertarian and neoliberal movement who thought that this was a correct interpretation of the post-Cold War moment, and that they too wanted to focus now more on securing small-scale conditions for liberty rather than focusing on globalism. You would focus on things like building contractual communities. So whether those were gated communities, in the American Southwest, small areas of economic ordering that were based on, leaving the banking system, protecting your own family, educating your own children, things that had long been common for a certain paranoid wing of the American right were now becoming attractive for parts of the economic libertarian right too.
Yeah, so it seems like their vision of their future vision of capitalism is kind of pessimistic, both economically, socially, and they have an eschatological view of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most interesting thing about, and the most counterintuitive or surprising thing about the end of the Cold War is that rather than assuming now that the global order would be secured permanently, many of the people who seem to have won the Cold War said the global scale is actually something to be abandoned now. And we can't expect to have full planetary universal freedom. Instead, let's return to something like a more pre-modern feudal arrangement of geography, where you will have islands of economic security and freedom in exchange and connection with other islands of security and freedom. And you will then kind of solve the problem of the 20th century by abandoning most of society to their own devices. I mean, you will no more welfare state if you just say, we have no responsibility for the poor, we have no responsibility for the hinterland. So it's, you know, I think it's important to see how geography below the level of the world has become one of the solutions in a way to the ongoing challenges of redistributive socialism for the right.
Yeah. I want to go back to Silicon Valley and let me quote from your book. Confounded by persistent demands for the redress of inequality at the expense of efficiency, stability, and order, neoliberals turn to nature in matters of race, intelligence, territory, and money as a way to erect a bulwark against the encroaching demands of progressives and hopefully roll back social change to return to a hierarchy of gender, race, and cultural difference they imagine to be rooted in genetics as well as tradition. It seems to me that Silicon Valley and the so-called tech bros are the embodiment of all these hard things you mentioned in your book. I mean, hardwire, hard currency, you know, the genetics. I mean, they have machismo, they are macho bros. They have the IQ obsession, faith in wealth and capitalism, nostalgia for old hierarchies, aristocratic rebellion, you name it. In that case, can we say that Silicon Valley capital or the Silicon Valley technological elites actually provides the material power that the so-called libertarians and the new right needs, especially if we consider Elon Musk and Peter Thiel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of main ways to answer that question. I think if you ask about the correspondence between the belief systems in Silicon Valley right and how they line up with the belief systems of someone like, you know, Friedrich Hayek, I think there's actually a pretty big conflict or contradiction between the two. So one of the things that Hayek was very interested in was claiming that we needed to have a kind of a provisional and not faith-like relationship to science, actually. So he was a very, very intense believer in the process of scientific experiment and discovery. I would say actually neoliberalism in some ways is an attempt to extend out the relationship that scientists have among each other in a laboratory space of discovery and experimentation. But he always took for granted that none of those discoveries would be permanent, that they had to be accepted as provisional and always being superseded, and that you shouldn't try to design a social order like a laboratory experiment per se. So while you should approach social problems like a scientist, you shouldn't assume that science would provide actually the blueprint for social order, because things like individualism, freedom were prerequisites for the good life for him, and you would never be able to kind of prove those in the lab. Where that differs, I think, from Silicon Valley thinking and the thinking of someone like Elon Musk is that they are actually proper technocrats, I believe. I think that they do believe that you can engineer society and you should engineer society, and that economic freedom or personal freedom is actually not a primary principle for them, or a sort of value that needs to be defended against encroachments. Actually, efficiency and productivity are more important than liberty and freedom. So that's why, and I in the book, the title of the book is Hayek's Bastards, because I think that in different ways, whether it's the racism of a Murray Rothbard or a technocratic engineering mentality of an Elon Musk, I think there's a kind of abandonment of the core individualism that, sat, for all it's worth, within the thinking of someone like Friedrich Hayek. That being said, I think that, it's quite clear that the American economy has completely thrived on the basis of Silicon Valley innovations in product creation and service creation for the last 25 years. Stock market valuations are completely dependent on a relatively small number of companies in the tech sector. So materially, the United States power is completely knitted together with the tech world. And for the most wealthy and prominent people in that world to throw their economic and cultural capital behind the MAGA project, I think is extremely significant. And they have provided, I think, as you suggest, the material foundation for a more successful transformative project this time around with MAGA. The question is whether or not there are some contradictions in that alliance that will make it, untenable in the long term. And I'm not sure. I think that it's an open question, but I think that the point I wanted to make is that I don't see the Silicon Valley Trump alliance as one primarily based on the correspondence of a certain philosophy or ideology. I do think it's more of a pragmatic alliance on both sides. And I think in the end, they both have different priorities that correspond for the time being, but, if pushed, might actually start to crack apart. And you've already seen many moments where that alliance becomes wobbly, even in the last 10 months.
I'm asking this for when I'm reading I was reading your books. It seems to me that those libertarian or neoliberal thinkers did not prone to politics, and after the Cold War, maybe they started to try some political connections. They started to wage or build up a mass base for their ideas, and it seems that now the Trump version 2 administration is has started to realized this mass base organization. I mean, with MAGA and tech libertarians and something like that. When I think in the elections of Ohio in 2022, the Charlie Kirk movement and Peter Thiel hand in hand supported J.D. Vance to become a senator. So it's a fruitful alliance, it seems.
Yeah, no, obviously. I mean, J.D. Vance was Thiel's candidate, who works to work for his company, and now he's vice president. So it worked at some level. And I think the paleo values of the social conservatives in the Trump administration and their antipathy towards certain kinds of regulatory control works also with the vision of a more free hand for entrepreneurs in the vision of Silicon Valley. But I think it depends on how far you push it, right? I mean, I think the kind of uncertainty being created through not just trade policy, but let's say doing things like rounding up all of the engineers at a Hyundai plant who are there to help build a new manufacturing facility, is a form of self-destruction that might actually start to irritate the tech people at some point. But to your first point about neoliberals being focused on a mass base, I think that's something that I'm trying to point out for sure in the Hayek's Bastards book, which is that just from a doctrinal point of view, if you just look like what are the neoliberals saying they want to do from the 1930s onward, then you see a kind of distrust basically of mass politics and a belief that in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, if you give people the vote and let them exercise their opinion, without mediation, then they will tend to choose socialism. That the people are kind of, whether through envy or atavistic sort of collectivist values, they tend to be communist by nature. And so the point of politics, this is what liberals have long thought, is to put enough guardrails and narrow the space of political expression enough that the people won't be able to express their natural communistic tendencies. That's the attitude that Hayek certainly had, and that's why he thought you needed to have many kind of checks and balances, why you needed to have independent branches of the legislature that would constantly be able to slow down moves coming from the population. He, like Carl Schmitt, relied on a distinction between legislation and law. So legislation meant things that came through governments, and then law were things that sat above everything and presented the ultimate values that needed to be protected. The way that this changes, especially under the influence of American populism, is that by the 1980s and 90s, the American branch of the neoliberal movement has started to try to figure out the ways that you could use Americans' natural sense of anti-authoritarianism and their sort of homesteading spirit to push back against the modern regulatory state and modern tax collecting state, and that you could create an alliance between people who just, in the American sense, just wanted to be left alone, and people who wanted to, give more power to private actors and take it out of the hands of the regulatory authorities. So the moment that I describe in the book is in the 1990s, when this guy, Murray Rothbard, takes on an advisory role with Pat Buchanan, who is running for president, running for the candidacy of the Republican Party in 1992. And came about things just a very different way. Rather than saying, America is the global superpower, we have a responsibility across the world, and we also need to respect at a basic level norms of human rights and civil rights, and a kind of a settlement that had emerged in the Republican Party, even through Reagan. He was just like, no, we're being invaded. America is being turned into a third world country. What do we owe the rest of the world? It's America first. And we need to pay attention to the demands of young white men who feel like they're being told that they're the bad guy all the time. So Buchanan and Rothbard, hand in hand, helped to roll out this rhetoric, which is now, of course, the dominant rhetoric in the Republican Party, which paradoxically sees specifically white men as the biggest victims, actually, of the modern world, and who need to be defended against apparently all of the people trying to disempower them. So that was certainly not something that someone like Hayek would have recommended as politics. In the 1950s, most neoliberal politics was about designing legal systems, designing, all kinds of basically ways that the people would have their arms tied and not be able to intervene in the economic market process. The neoliberal populism of even of a Javier Milei or certain ways Bolsonaro is to use certain kinds of social issues to draw people towards an austerity-driven program that will ultimately, make things materially worse for them.
Yeah. In your book, Crack-Up Capitalism, you discuss the concept of, I think, the perforation of national sovereignty. What is proposed as an escape from taxes, unions, trade unions, politics, and elections is either a multitude of mini-states or the creation of enclaves within states that weaken the sovereignty of the state. I want to ask about maybe the most pressing issue in the world today, the Gaza situation, because it appears that the so-called Blair-Kushner plan announced by Donald Trump actually envisions a Palestine divided into so-called economic zones that will supposedly create employment with sovereignty transferred to an international trusteeship. And the whole of your book, I mean, the Crack-Up Capitalism, you analyzed that those neoliberals and Silicon Valley elites are trying to escape state sovereignties. They love Dubai, they love Singapore, they love Hong Kong. They want to create free zones in Honduras or even Somali. So how can the desire of this capital, the Silicon Valley capital, and or the neoliberal libertarian fantasies to eliminate national sovereignty be so intertwined with American geopolitical ambitions today, if in terms of Gaza plan or Gaza situation? Moreover, although Gaza is the most recent example, and you have also examined it through your book, it is not the only one, because as you mentioned in your book, I think there are hundreds of economic zones that escape national sovereignties around the world.
Yeah, I mean, so this Crack-Up Capitalism I wrote partially just to, I think, intervene in what I thought was an unproductive framing of the problem of global order since 2016. So since Brexit and Trump, we had heard again and again that we had globalism or we had nationalism, and these were the two alternatives, and an era of globalization was coming to an end, and it was returning as the pendulum swung back to nations. And some people celebrated that, other people criticized that. But my feeling was that it missed something very basic about the organization of global political economy since the end of the Cold War, which is that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there haven't just been nations and the world, I mean, let alone regions, but there had been the creation of actually not hundreds, but thousands. Now we have over 6,000 special economic zones throughout the world, which are small jurisdictions inside of nations that have a different set of laws, a different set of taxation policies, usually a different set of labor and environmental regulations. And these are not so much sites of escape from state power or national power. In fact, they're mostly used by nations to lure in mobile capital, to give them conditions that are more attractive to them, less oversight from officials, less oversight from regulations, and so on. But since the end of the Cold War, the world has been, in fact, sort of perforated, as I say, by this galaxy of different kinds of economic zones. And that if you look at some of the famous right-wing populists of the last decade, look at Viktor Orban, look at Matteo Salvini or Giorgia Meloni, what are they doing with their countries? Well, on the one hand, yes, they're hardening borders and becoming more aggressive against undocumented immigration, but they're also creating special economic zones and bringing in foreign capital. So Orban has made new special economic zones to bring in investment from China and Korea. Salvini and Meloni did the same, turning the whole south of Italy into special economic zones. Poland, under the PIS right-wing party, created a whole special economic zone. So my point was that what has been often described as a kind of a backlash against global capitalism is using some of those very tools of high globalization to accelerate forms of zero-sum competition, more rights for mobile investors in some cases, while also playing a social conservative game at the same time. And the persistence of those kind of instruments of high neoliberalism, I think, are very obvious in the case of something like the plans for post-conflict Gaza, if we can even talk about that being a possibility, because I don't think that it will be post-conflict or post-war unless it is completely paved over the way that some of these proposals have suggested. But if you look at the suggestions, a great moment where you see Netanyahu, Trump, Tony Blair, and the Boston Consulting Group all basically agreeing on the same thing, which is that this cannot be a place governed by one person, one vote democracy, right? The principles from Woodrow Wilson in 1919, which supposedly are the principles of the modern world, aren't even discussed. This is going to be a place that is operated like an industrial park or a special investment zone, where management is like external CEOs and public officials, and conditions are created on the ground to bring in as much investment as possible. And the focus is really on infrastructure and the free movement of goods and capital, and very little emphasis put
apart from
on
Tony Blair, the so-called Board of Peace. There are some suggestions of names like Apollo CEO, an Egyptian billionaire. I forgot his name, and some of Trump's billionaire friends. One of Trump's billionaire friends, so on and so on. So this is exactly what you're saying now.
Yeah. So the two things can, of course, coexist, and we shouldn't be surprised, right? I mean, you can have a new language of blood and soil within the United States, which there certainly is, while still having this vision of entrepreneurial adventurism and opening up of new territories being reformatted and redescribed in ways that do not correspond with either with the idea of national sovereignty or really the old idea of empire. So Greenland is another good example of this, right? Yeah. An idea that it could be sort of annexed in an informal way and then turned into a place for experimentations in probably satellite downlink stations and extractive industries, and then maybe new forms of commodified collectivity in the style of the charter city. So we should, I think, continue to expect not a kind of a narrowing of political geography down to a world returning of just nations, but actually a multiplication of these liminal and heterodox ways of organizing territory that, as always, tend to disempower the poorest inside of them the most.
Yeah. Yes, you just mentioned Europe, and finally, let's turn to Europe because it seems connected with the new fusion across Atlantic. Although parties and figures such as AfD, PVV in Holland, in Netherlands, and Viktor Orban are seen as illiberal or populists, you point in your book to the economic programs of these movements, and it is clear that they are actually neoliberal, I think. I recently read an article by Angelos Chrysogelos on national conservatism, and he also describes this process as the territorialization of neoliberalism. What would you say about the headlines about the rising right, far right in Europe, in terms of the debates over neoliberalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my first book, the one that was translated into Turkish, Globalists, made a pretty strong argument about the essence of neoliberalism being the attempt to restore a kind of a global market order. And that from the 1930s, there was a strong effort to say we need a rules-based multilateral arrangement in which free trade, movement of capital is maximally protected. That version of neoliberalism has very few champions anymore, right? I mean, you don't find hardly anyone who will make their primary demand, the recreation of a free trade global order. On the left and the right, that's discredited. it doesn't really have any defenders, though WTO is effectively a dead duck sitting in Geneva. So the question is then, can you redefine what neoliberalism is in a way that that global part is stripped out, and it's just about, let's say, ensuring bilateral ties between Chinese investors and local party elites in Hungary who can profit from some form of investment. I'm kind of divided on that. I mean, I am more prone to suggest that the fight of neoliberalism was always at a global level, and if the global level has now been put out of commission, then I'm not sure how helpful the term actually is anymore. I think that's hence the bastardization, the mutation. I think Alice Weidel of the AFD refers to the AFD as a libertarian conservative party. That's her own way of describing it.
Yeah.
And in a way, I find that more of an accurate description than neoliberal, because she's confessing there that the libertarian part it's actually anti-welfarist, it's pro-business, it's pro-austerity, it's pro-hard money. The conservative part is we're going to supposedly finance the rest of that stuff through punitive anti-immigrant policy, I guess accelerating extractivism, pushing up the productivity of workers through exploitation. I think if you follow their own language, maybe you can get closer to the particularity of the present moment than trying to resurrect, I think, the neoliberal label for one last run. I think that there's ways that the oppositional quality of neoliberalism that was effective for so long is maybe starting to lose its power. And it might be more helpful for us to understand how we got here and then figure out what terms help us make sense of the present better. And I think it's worth mentioning, I mean, so Europe, I think, is not a unified territory, obviously. Yeah. And if you ask the question, who is actually navigating the difficult economic straits of the present moment most effectively? Currently, right now, the answer is Spain under a socialist government. And why? Partially because they are welcoming immigration, especially from people with Spanish heritage in Latin America. Partially because they're welcoming in Chinese investment and making use of it where they can. And partially because they are, responding to people's demands through more levels of corporate accountability, while also, bringing business interests in line with the social agenda. So I think that there's a lot of denial in the Northern European space about what they can do, and they're torn between their Americans, who they've always been used to kowtowing to, and the Chinese, which they are attracted to, but feel now they're not allowed to work with. Whereas countries that can ideologically carve out their own space, like Spanish socialists, are freer, I think, to be pragmatic about the present moment. So it's one of those other moments where I don't know if terms like neoliberal really help us to navigate these complicated times as well as maybe they once did.
Yeah. That's all my questions. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, it was a great broadcast. Thank you very much for joining us. Also, we are eagerly awaiting your new book about Elon Musk.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if there's a Turkish translation.
You can make a teaser for us.
Yeah, I mean, so it's called Muskism. It's the subtitle is A Guide for the Perplexed. And the core argument is that what Muskism is the promise of sovereignty through technology, but that the reality of it is it always turns into greater dependency on Musk. You could also say NVIDIA. You could also say Peter Thiel and Palantir. That the essence of the Silicon Valley ideology is to pretend to give you autonomy and then actually produce deeper dependence.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Slobodian.
Thank you for speaking to me.
Yeah.